Hi, this is Brian Kim, and I'd like to share with you my second attempt at intrascleral haptic fixation using the Yamane flange technique. The first case I tried was with an MA60 AC lens that was already in the eye and it was dislocating. I tried to fixate it with a double needle technique, and in the process of manipulating it, I broke the haptic at the optic junction. And so with this second attempt, I'm using an EC3 PAL lens because it's got stronger haptics, and it is a new lens, not an existing lens. So hopefully it was going to give me a better chance for success. You can see here this lens is significantly loose. This lens was subluxed by 50% at the slit lamp, and the lens is significantly sitting at a significantly posterior position. I'm using a Sinska hook to get around the lens, but you can see I get around the optic, but I need to get around the edge of the capsular bag in order to be able to prolapse this lens upward. And so now I'm getting at the edge of the capsular bag there, and what I'm going to do is keep pushing and so I can access that space, and I'm going to place a reverse Sinski hook in there, and that will allow me to get underneath the lens. And then as I rotate the Sinski, I'm able to hook the lens optic, and prolapse it into the anterior chamber. I'm sitting superiorly for this case because I want the double needle technique, the scleral passes to be at the horizontal position. Thankfully here, this lens, the superior haptic popped up nicely into the anterior chamber. However, the inferior one wasn't cooperating as well. And this reverse Sinski hook is not really meant for this maneuver, and so I switched it to this Maltzman instrument, which is able to retract the iris and prolapse that inferior haptic up nicely. I'm placing viscoelastic between the lens and the corneal endothelium, and with these MST intraocular scissors, I'm going to cut. And one thing I noticed is you can re-grab with your forceps by holding the lens with the scissors in between the teeth. And so you can cut and then hold and then re-grab with the forceps on the left. And you want to inch away from you and grabbing the optic further away from you, because that gives you better leverage as you cut. And so that's a little pearl that I picked up as I been learning to cut lenses a little bit more efficiently. And now that I've externalized this haptic, another thing that's easy to do is, in order to grab this lens, which tends to be very slippery and it slides away from you, just push the optic away from you, push it into the angle, and that will give you enough counter traction to help you hold that lens, and then you can prolapse it, pull it out of the eye. And this is the second half, and did the same maneuver. Here I'm using dispersive viscoelastic to get past this Sommering's ring that's been left behind in the anterior chamber, rather than going in there with fluidics and risking this material to go into the vitreous space. I'm using just pressure using viscoelastic. I'm increasing the pressure inside the eye and pushing the lens material towards my incision. You can see some of its prolapse. Now I'm going to burp the wound, and as I burp it, you can see the rest of the lens material is able to come out, and it's right at the edge of my wound. So all of that Sommering's ring was in the bag was evacuated. I'm checking for vitreous, and interestingly enough, which is often the case with these sublux lenses, there's not much vitreous to be found, which explains why the lens subluxes in these cases. I go 2.5 millimeters posterior to the limbus, and this is a 23 gauge MVR blade that I made a stab incision to the pars plana space. I'm using anterior chamber irrigation and a pars plana vitrectomy. And as I perform the vitrectomy, I'm sweeping the incision using my irrigation handpiece as a cyclodialysis spatula to sweep the wound. And I'm pretty confident there's no vitreous in the anterior chamber now. I marked 2 millimeters posterior to the limbus, and also 2 millimeters proximal to me in the same limbal, at the level of the limbus, to help delineate my needle technique. I'm going to try to start where that small area of heme is. I'm using a fixation ring, and I'm going to go 2 millimeters towards my mark, and that's going to be where I dive into the sclera. And I'm deliberately made these marks while the patient was upright using a toric marking device so that I can make sure that I'm 180 degrees away, so the lens will be well centered. So then I stab into through the sclera and into the eye. And I'm going to use these MST forceps to help me manipulate the lens and to be able to pass this haptic into the lumen of the needle. Unfortunately, I did not have the thin-walled 30 gauge needle for this technique, and I'm using a 27 gauge. I was a little bit anxious that perhaps it would slip and I'd have to start over and fetch the lens. And so I don't know if this was wise, but I was trying to hold the lens with the MST forceps as I pulled it. And I don't know if that caused it to slip. I don't know if I helped or hurt myself, but nonetheless, that's what I did for this second attempt. And I did get the haptic externalized, but it's very shallow, and there's conjunctiva and heme covering the haptic. And so I'm using my right hand to hold the MST forcep, holding the haptic inside the eye, and I'm using my left hand to try to find the edge of this, the tip of this haptic using some forceps. And you can see that there's conjunctiva in the way. So I'm having to try to fumble around and try to grab that haptic. Once I feel confident I grabbed it, I'm releasing with the MST forcep in the eye, and then I try to bluntly dissect that conjunctiva away, and I'm able to grab the haptic. So with a big sigh of relief, I'm able to grab the haptic, and then using the cautery without touching it, just getting real close to the haptic, it causes that bulb to form at the end of the haptic. And I'm not using the double needle technique because when I first did this with that MA60 AC lens, when I pulled both haptics out, one of them slipped and it just made things very difficult. I saw another surgeon use this maneuver going one at a time. And so I thought that might be an easier way, at least a safer way, a safety net way, just doing the needle one at a time. So I think the Thornton ring really helps to fixate the eye. I'm going, again, intrascleral, starting from my one mark, going to the second mark, and that's where I'm going to dive in. Again, this helps to assure that I'm 180 degrees away. And that's, again, pre-marked in the holding area with my toric axis mark, or toric marker, which marks the 3 and 9 o'clock position. I'm going to use a needle to help position the lens, and then I'm going to place the haptics into the incision and use that needle to prolapse the optic upward. And I've seen other videos, and a pearl that I picked up watching the videos is you want to push the edge of the optic upward, and that helps access the haptic. Otherwise, you're going to be finding yourself grabbing into the angle, which might not be very easy. So again, you want to use the needle to push the edge of the optic, and that allows access of the haptic, as you can see right there. And this is a little bit awkward, but I'm able to get that haptic and thread it through the lumen of the needle. With the MA60, this was where I, after it slipped out of the sclera, as I pulled it through, I tried to retrieve it at this step, and as I did the maneuvering, it caused the haptic to break. And so with the EC3 PAL haptic, it's much stronger. And so I felt like this was the best lens to try for this technique for the first time, especially when the maneuvers are not intuitive, and I'm not used to this. So thankfully, I'm able to finally pull this haptic out, and it's important that you turn the needle into the position of the direction of the haptic as you pull it out. And then again, I use cautery to create that bulb. I'm using a irrigation and aspiration and with a low cut rate to remove any viscoelastic and potential vitreous in the anterior chamber. There was no visible vitreous as I was doing that, and I'm going to go and rapid speed and just close all the incisions here just for security. I'm closing my main incision. So under 4x speed, you can see I'm going to close my sclerotomy incision, and I'll also close conjunctiva. This case took me a little over 30 minutes to perform, and for a second attempt, I think this is much more efficient than all the previous skull fixation techniques that I've tried. The failure that I had using the pre-existing MA60 AC lens could have been because the lens was old and in the eye and with brittle haptics, or perhaps my maneuvering was too aggressive and caused the haptics to bend. Regardless, the EC3 PAL lens is definitely a better choice for someone who's starting off with this technique. The haptics are much stronger and more resistant to breakage and tolerable to manipulation. I'd like to try a 30 gauge thin wall needle next time. Because I used a 27 gauge, I was a little reluctant, and so I used a sequential needle placement rather than double needle placement. And I think that is something that you can also do successfully. You can see that the eye lens looks nice and stable. At the end of this case, I always apply subconjunctival ANSAF for any vitrectomy case. So again, EC3 PAL, definitely a good lens for this technique. And for the future, the thin wall 30 gauge needle to help ensure the successful retrieval of the haptic through the sclerotomy. Thank you for your attention.